It was supposed to be the perfect day for the Johnson family. A fresh start in a new home, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But as their moving truck rolls up, something's off. The street, usually buzzing with friendly faces and waves, suddenly grows silent. Neighbors stop in their tracks, eyeing the newcomers with suspicion. It's as if they've already made up their minds about the Johnsons, without even saying a word. Whispers fill the air, and before long, the gossip begins to spread like wildfire. One neighbor, Karen, takes it a step further, spreading rumors, making complaints, even trying to block the family's move-in altogether. But here's the twist. These neighbors have no idea who the Johnsons really are, and what happens next will leave them shocked, speechless, and regretting every assumption they made. What they don't know is that behind those boxes and packed-up belongings, there's a truth about this family that will turn everything they thought they knew upside down. Trust me, you won't believe the shocking turn of events that awaits these neighbors. Stay tuned, because this story is about to get a lot more interesting. The Johnsons had always dreamed of this moment. After years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices, Marcus and Michelle Johnson, along with their 2 children, had finally secured their dream home. The house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything they had worked so hard to achieve. A new chapter in their lives, a suburban neighborhood that promised peace, security, and the chance for their kids to grow up in a place of opportunity. It was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, a fresh beginning. But reality hit them the moment they arrived. Instead of the warm welcome they had envisioned, the Johnsons were greeted by cold stares and whispered comments. The familiar sounds of neighborhood greetings were replaced by an eerie silence as they unloaded their belongings. It didn't take long for them to realize that something wasn't right. Karen, a prominent and outspoken member of the community, wasted no time in making her feelings known. She began spreading rumors, suggesting that the Johnsons weren't fit for the neighborhood, planting seeds of doubt and distrust among the residents. It wasn't just the typical neighborly concern. It felt like an outright hostility that no one could ignore. What should have been a seamless transition into their new life was quickly turning into a battleground. The Johnsons hadn't just moved into a new house. They had unwittingly stepped into a storm. As Michelle and Marcus soon discovered, their dream home was now at the center of a community divided. What followed would be a fight for their right to belong. A fight they didn't expect, but one they would soon be forced to face. And little did they know, the battle for justice was about to begin in the most unexpected and shocking way. The Johnsons' excitement about their new home quickly faded as the days passed. What should have been a smooth transition into suburban bliss turned into a series of unexpected challenges that they hadn't prepared for. The first signs of trouble came in the form of Karen, the self-appointed welcoming neighbor. With a forced smile plastered on her face, she knocked on their door, pretending to extend an olive branch. But her friendly exterior quickly gave way to something much more sinister. Behind her hollow pleasantries, Karen was already spreading her poison, sowing the seeds of distrust within the community. She wasted no time in approaching other neighbors, whispering rumors and sowing division. "Do you know who they are? What kind of people might be moving into our neighborhood?" she would ask, her words dripping with disdain. The damage was done almost immediately. Karen's subtle but insidious campaign worked its way through the neighborhood, turning what was supposed to be a close-knit, welcoming community into a hotbed of suspicion and fear. It wasn't long before complaints began flooding in from all corners. Neighbors filed reports about supposed noise, despite the fact that the Johnsons had barely moved in. Others spoke of dangerous people driving by their house, and some even accused the family of vague property damage, though nothing could be confirmed. For Michelle and Marcus, it felt like their dream was slipping away, piece by piece. Michelle, in particular, felt the weight of the community's judgment on her shoulders. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, her voice quivered with frustration. "I just wanted a safe space for us," she said, the tears threatening to spill over. "Is that too much to ask?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the burden of trying to make a life for her family in a place that was supposed to offer safety and opportunity, but was instead becoming a battlefield for something much more destructive. As the days turned into weeks, the constant barrage of complaints took a heavy toll on the Johnson family. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge, an obstacle that made their dream of suburban life feel more and more like a distant fantasy. The initial excitement that had filled Marcus and Michelle's hearts when they moved into their new home began to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of isolation and frustration. What was supposed to be a new beginning had quickly turned into a nightmare of suspicion and resentment. The complaints grew more frequent, and with each one, the Johnsons felt further distanced from the very community they had hoped to join. It started with small things, passive-aggressive comments from neighbors as they passed by, their eyes filled with judgment. "I heard they don't even belong here," one neighbor said, loud enough for Michelle to overhear while she was out front gardening. Another muttered as they walked their dog, "I wonder how long they'll last before they get in trouble." But as the whispers and stares continued, it became clear that the Johnsons' presence was no longer welcome in the neighborhood. What hurt most was the intervention of local authorities. At first, it seemed like a simple misunderstanding. A few complaints about noise, an unmarked car driving by too slowly, or even a child's bike left on the front lawn became pretexts for safety checks. Michelle and Marcus were told that police would be making regular rounds in the area for the community's safety, even though no specific incident had ever occurred. But when Karen began knocking on their door with vague and baseless complaints about their supposed reckless behavior, the Johnsons realized the true extent of the battle they were fighting. Every day felt like a constant uphill struggle. Michelle, who had worked tirelessly to make this dream come true, started to feel a deep sense of doubt creeping in. She had envisioned a peaceful life for her children, a place where they could grow up free from the struggles they'd faced before. But now, every interaction felt charged with suspicion. At the local grocery store, she could feel eyes on her, people talking in hushed tones behind her back. It was as if the Johnsons weren't just newcomers to the neighborhood, they were intruders. Her emotional exhaustion was evident. She began questioning her decision to move. Was it worth it? Had she been too naive to believe that hard work and determination could overcome such ingrained prejudice? One evening, as she sat in the living room with her head in her hands, she confided in Marcus. "Maybe we were wrong to think this place could be different," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Maybe we're not welcome here, and maybe we never will be." But Marcus, though exhausted and beaten down by the constant hostility, refused to give up. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, and as the days dragged on, his resolve only strengthened. He wasn't going to let this community drive them away. "They want to drive us out," Marcus told Michelle one night, his voice low and thick with anger. "But I'm not leaving. Not without a fight." His words, though filled with frustration, carried a fierce determination. He knew they were being unfairly targeted, but he wasn't going to let that destroy everything they had worked so hard for. Despite the emotional toll, the constant battle was starting to build a kind of resilience in the Johnsons that they hadn't expected. The strain was bringing them closer together, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and insecurities, but it was also igniting a new kind of fire within them. They couldn't allow the negativity of their neighbors to dictate their lives. They had earned their place in this community, and they wouldn't let anyone take that away from them. But what they didn't know was just how deep the prejudice ran within the community. While the Johnsons fought to stand their ground, they still hadn't uncovered the full extent of the animosity directed at them. Karen wasn't just a meddling neighbor with a personal vendetta. She was part of a larger, more insidious network of residents who shared the same views. The whispers and complaints weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated efforts to make the Johnsons' lives miserable, to force them out of a place they had every right to call home. As Marcus and Michelle found themselves locked in a battle for their dignity and their place in the community, they couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could hold on. They had no idea what their neighbors were truly capable of, but one thing was clear: the fight for justice was just beginning. The breaking point came when Michelle received a letter in the mail, a formal notice for a mandatory neighborhood meeting. The message was direct and unsettling. Karen, along with several other neighbors, had gone behind the Johnsons' backs and escalated the situation to the city's planning department. They had called for an official review of the Johnsons' move, citing unfounded concerns about safety and community values. The letter made it clear that the meeting would be held to address these complaints, a final attempt to either validate or reject the growing tension in the neighborhood. For Michelle and Marcus, this felt like the final straw. It was one thing to endure passive-aggressive comments, vague accusations, and baseless complaints, but now their entire future in the community was being questioned in front of the city's planning department. Michelle knew that this was more than just a neighborhood dispute. This was an orchestrated campaign to strip them of their right to live in peace. Despite their mounting frustration, they had no choice but to attend the meeting. It would be a battle, but they were determined to face it head-on. The night of the meeting, Michelle felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. As they arrived at the community center, she could already sense the hostility in the air. The room was filled with neighbors, many of whom had been making anonymous complaints, their eyes narrow and suspicious as they glanced at her and Marcus. Karen was sitting front and center, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. Michelle's heart raced. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't prepared for the level of hostility that greeted them. When Michelle stepped to the front of the room to address the gathering, an eerie silence fell over the crowd. Every eye was on her, and the tension was palpable. It felt as though every word she spoke would be scrutinized, and every move she made would be dissected. But before she could say anything, the mayor, who had been quietly watching the proceedings, stood up from his seat at the front of the room. The room quieted even further as he took the microphone. "We're proud to announce," the mayor began, his voice calm but filled with authority, "that the Johnsons' move into the neighborhood was part of our diversity and inclusion initiative, a project that Michelle Johnson has worked tirelessly on." A murmur ran through the crowd as Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what was happening. But the mayor continued, clearly ready to turn the tide in a direction no one had anticipated. "Michelle is the city's lead planner for this initiative," the mayor went on. "She's responsible for integrating multicultural communities into suburban areas. And what many of you may not realize is that her work has been instrumental in creating the very kind of neighborhood you're a part of. The kind of neighborhood that values diversity and welcomes new residents from all walks of life." Gasps filled the room as the truth began to sink in. Michelle could hear murmurs of disbelief, but the weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. The woman they had vilified, the woman they had painted as an outsider, an intruder, was not only a part of their community, but she was also a key figure in the very project they claimed to support. The neighbors, especially Karen, froze in shock. The realization hit them hard. Karen, who had been leading the charge against the Johnsons, was stunned into silence, her mouth hanging open as her previous accusations unraveled before her eyes. Michelle stood still for a moment, processing the turn of events. She could feel the room's collective gaze shift from suspicion to a hesitant understanding, but there was no denying the damage that had already been done. The fight wasn't over yet, but this unexpected revelation had turned the tide in their favor. The truth was out. The neighbors now knew who Michelle really was, and they would have to reckon with the fact that they had been attacking the very person working to make their community better. The Johnsons weren't the problem, they were part of the solution. As Michelle looked out at the stunned faces in the room, she knew that this was the turning point. The battle for acceptance wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid for a new kind of conversation. A conversation that would require the community to face its own prejudices and reevaluate its assumptions. And as for Karen, the woman who had set all of this in motion was left in stunned silence, realizing that the fight she had started was far from over, but now it was a fight she might not win. In the aftermath of the meeting, the mood in the neighborhood began to shift. The residents who had once rallied against the Johnsons, swayed by Karen's divisive rhetoric, now found themselves questioning their actions. As the truth about Michelle's involvement in the city's diversity and inclusion initiative spread, it became clear that they had misjudged not only the Johnsons, but their entire community. The idea of welcoming diversity, something they had claimed to support, had been twisted into fear and suspicion. Now, the very neighbors who had once turned their backs on the Johnsons were left to confront the uncomfortable truth that their actions had been driven by prejudice and misunderstanding. Karen, once the ringleader of the attack, found herself isolated. Her attempts to tear down the Johnsons had backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. While the rest of the community slowly began to reconcile with the reality of the situation, Karen had become a symbol of the very intolerance she had tried to stir up. The whispers that had once filled the air now turned against her. Neighbors who had once quietly supported her were now openly distancing themselves, and Karen was left to deal with the fallout from her own actions. Her influence in the neighborhood had diminished, and her standing in the community had been irreparably damaged. For Michelle, this was an opportunity to step into a leadership role, but not in a way that would perpetuate the anger and division that had nearly torn the neighborhood apart. She approached the residents not with confrontation, but with quiet strength and dignity. At a follow-up community meeting, Michelle stood before the gathered neighbors and, with a calm yet powerful voice, addressed them. "This neighborhood has the potential to be a model of what real diversity can look like," she said, her words resonating in the room. "But it starts with understanding each other. It starts with being open to the idea that our differences are what make us stronger, not weaker." Her message was one of inclusion, not division. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't demand apologies. Instead, she extended a hand to those who were willing to listen, encouraging them to build a community based on respect and mutual understanding. Michelle's words were a turning point, not just for the Johnsons, but for the entire neighborhood. The focus was no longer on the divide that had once seemed so insurmountable. Now, the conversation was about healing, about learning to live together despite differences, and about creating a space where everyone, regardless of background, could feel welcomed and valued. For Marcus and Michelle, the journey had been difficult, but the victory was bittersweet. They had not only fought for their right to live in peace, they had also earned the respect of their neighbors, some of whom had initially doubted them. The emotional toll had been immense, but it had also strengthened their bond. As Marcus walked arm in arm with Michelle down the street, they felt a sense of pride and accomplishment they hadn't experienced before. It was no longer just about surviving in their new home, it was about thriving. The neighborhood, once a battleground, was now a place of hope. The Johnsons had shown that change was possible, even in the face of adversity. And while the work of building a truly inclusive community was far from over, the first steps had been taken. The Johnsons had not only won the battle for their home, they had sparked a change in the hearts and minds of those around them. The future, once uncertain, now held promise. The neighborhood was no longer a place of division and hostility, but a place where understanding, respect, and unity could grow. And for Marcus and Michelle, that was a victory worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of standing up against injustice, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Share this video to raise awareness about how we can all be part of creating more inclusive communities. Let's keep the conversation going. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on the impact of prejudice and how we can break down these barriers together. Thanks for watching, and until next time.